I don't know how many talks I've ever done in all my time of being a minister. I now have the best opening line I've ever had to any talk I've ever given, especially an Easter talk. Donald Trump is trying to get hold of one of my shoes. Donald Trump is after a piece of my footwear. Would you believe it? Donald Trump, as we know at the moment, is after just about everything, isn't he? He's trying to get hold of Greenland. Most of us didn't know where Greenland was, admit it. But anyway, he's trying to get hold of it. He's trying to get hold of Gaza. He's trying to get hold of Canada, and they're all delighted about that. He's trying to get hold of chunks of Ukraine. But there's something else that Donald Trump still has his eye on. Not so much in the news, but it has been. Donald Trump wants to get hold of the Panama Canal. He wants to get hold of the Panama Canal. In case you don't know where Panama is, here we are. So Panama in the little stretch of Central America between North America and South America, right through Panama, that is where the Panama Canal is. And Donald Trump wants it back. That top picture shows you the advantage of the Panama Canal. Before that was built, if you wanted to get by ship from one side of the United States to the other, you had to go all the way down the bottom, all the way back up, and now you can pretty much pop through. Not quite. So really, really important. The French began building the Panama Canal in 1881. I know all these things. And it was completed by the Americans in 1914. And it was handed over to Panama, eventually ran as a kind of a joint partnership. It's been run by, I think, the Panama Canal Authority since then. But Donald Trump thinks the Americans are not being treated fairly. And now he wants control back. Now he's got distracted by a few other things at the moment. But here's the thing. At the bottom of the Panama Canal, in between the shopping trolleys and bicycle frames, is a shoe. It's a small shoe, a 3-year-old shoe, and it belongs to me. So if Trump gets the Panama Canal, he's also going to get my shoe. Just one shoe. I don't know where the other one is, but just one. When I was 3 years old, I deposited it there. Now, how did that happen? Well, again, if you're familiar with me and my family's story, my parents were missionaries for many years in South America, in the country of Bolivia. Bolivia is right smack in the center of South America. And they went out first in 1956, my parents, as an engaged couple, to start their missionary work. My mother was a nurse and a midwife, and my dad was going to help with kind of rural churches and so on. So they sailed from Liverpool in 1956 across the Atlantic and then through the Panama Canal, down the west coast of South America to Chile, and then they popped in by train from Chile into Bolivia. So that was in 1956. They were in Bolivia for 5 years, in which time my older brother, Andrew, was born, and then I was born. And when I was 1 year old, they sailed back through the Panama Canal and made the same journey again. Here's an actual picture from 1961 of sailing through the Panama Canal. So they returned to the UK then, and then in 1963, after about 18 months here in the UK, they returned to Bolivia for a second term. This time they sailed from Southampton. There's my mum and dad on the left. There's my sister, not Pauline, she wasn't around yet, Helen in the blue thingy. There's my older brother Andrew. There's my grandmother, and there's me on the end. So I started bald, I did a bit of hair, and then I've returned to bald in between. So there we are. So that was 1963 on the dock in Southampton, about to make the journey back across the Atlantic. and I was equipped with a brand new pair of shoes. I'm very disappointed that the shoes didn't make it onto the picture. But anyway, that journey then, with me as a 3-year-old, took us back through the Panama Canal. This apparently, the internet's a wonderful thing. This is the exact boat. It was called the Reina del Mar, the Queen of the Seas, and it's going through the Panama Canal through one of the locks. So that's the exact ship that I was on. And we got to the Panama Canal. Apparently, I'm a bit young to remember the details, but we were all stood there on the railings watching the wonders of the Panama Canal, and suddenly I said to my mother something along the lines of, "Shoe, shoe." And she looked down, and my shoe had disappeared into the Panama Canal. And it's still there, as far as I know, to this day. There have been expeditions to try and find it, but apparently not. And so for the rest of the journey on that ship, I was barefoot. I'm sure I wasn't exactly. But anyway, so that's me as a 3-year-old on the ship going back out to Bolivia. So if Mr. Trump wants that canal back, he's going to own part of me. I'm not going to tell you what I feel positively or negatively about that. What is the point of this? Well, partly because ever since my Panama Canal adventures, I've had quite an interest in the Panama Canal. Been through it a couple of times, not remembered all of it necessarily, but it's actually a very fascinating story. Here's the canal as it is pretty much today. There's sort of boats going one way and boats coming the other, and it's a fascinating story. It's in the 16th century as the sort of, we would call it, the world was being discovered, that sailors realized that actually if they could somehow get through that narrow bit of land between North and South America, trade would be absolutely transformed. But they didn't have the technology to do it then, so they were still having to sail all around the bottom of South America and back up. It was in the late 1800s that technology had advanced, and it was decided that they would have a go at building a canal through Panama. There was a Frenchman, his name was Ferdinand de Lesseps, I don't know, but that's him anyway, who was appointed to build this canal. He'd built the Suez Canal, and so he was asked to do the job of building the Panama Canal, and he got to work. But there was one big difference between Suez and Panama. Suez is flat, so all you have to do is dig a dirty great big trench. Panama, unfortunately, is stuck between the Rocky Mountains of North America and the Andes Mountains of South America, and it's rather hilly. There's about 85 meters or 25 meters of hillside that you have to get through. Well, Mr. Lesseps thought, no problem, let's just dig our way through this. And unfortunately, it didn't quite work. And after about 9 years, the project ground to a halt. Ferdinand de Lesseps was dismissed, and another construction bloke was appointed. He was an American. So this is the American connection, John Frank Stevens. He'd built the Great Northern Railway, apparently, so he wasn't too used to too many hills, I guess. But he had the idea, look, we're not going to go try and tunnel our way through the middle of all this rock. We'll build some locks. We're in Birmingham, we know about locks and canals. Well, these were dirty, great big ones that would take boats up. There's a huge lake that they dammed up some rivers and made a big, big lake in between, and some locks to go out the other end, whichever way you're going. And so he got to work, and the canal was built. 1914, the very first boat went through. That's a picture, apparently, of the very first boat going through the Panama Canal. It's been upgraded since because ships have got so massively huge now, so huge things are going through the Panama Canal. Cruise liners go through it. 11,000 transits of vessels apparently every year through the Panama Canal. 200 million metric tons of cargo. I don't know, what does that look like? It's big, isn't it? So it's a fascinating construction that made a huge difference, actually, in the end, to all of us in some ways, by making transit and transport and and cargo so much easier to deliver. But you know, there's one thing that only dawned on me in time when I was interested in the story of the construction of the Panama Canal. And that was the huge cost. And I don't mean the money cost. It's cost many billions, as you can imagine. It was all upgraded, I don't know, maybe 20 years ago to fit the hugest, biggest ships, and that was billions. But no, the cost in lives. That's what's so astonishing about the building of the Panama Canal. This is just one of many canal zone cemeteries for workers who lost their lives building the canal. Apparently, it's the highest death toll of any construction project in peacetime. Of course, there are wartime constructions that, for all kinds of reasons, cost many more lives. Apparently, up to about 30,000 workers lost their lives building that canal. About 25,000 in the initial French stage, and then about 5,000 in the later American stage. There are all kinds of dangers, of course, but the main problem was these things, was the mosquitoes. It wasn't quite realized then, the disease that they carried. And so malaria, yellow fever was rife. And it took a huge, huge toll on the workers. In fact, I read that during that time, they were more worried about ants. They thought it was the ants that were the problem. And so in the dormitories of the workers, they set the bunks in big bowls of water. So what likes still water? Malaria. So the ants were kept away and the mosquitoes were invited in. By the time the Americans took over the project, they'd understood a bit more about malaria. Huge, huge fumigation efforts, extraordinary, in Panama itself and all around the canal zone. So the more I've read about this, the more I've realized that this way through that fascinates me, this way through that made such a difference, was only possible through an incredible, costly sacrifice. And now, at last, we've landed at Easter, haven't we? What is Easter? How would you define what Easter is about? How about this as a definition? It was a way through being made at incredible cost. That's Easter. Here's a familiar kind of Easter picture, okay, a cross on a hillside. That hillside is actually right behind the house where my wife grew up in South Gloucestershire, and her family still live there, her parents, as part of the Cotswold Way. There's you can see it from the motorway between junction 13 and 14. If you kind of look left, there's this conical hill. It's called Campeak. And every year, locals take a cross and they put it up on top of the hill. What's the cross about? You'll notice in the pictures of the Canal Zone Cemetery, every one has got a cross. So it's clearly about death of some sort, isn't it? But it's about much, much more than that. It's about making a way through. That's what the cross is about. Here's just one part of the Bible that expresses it so well. God was pleased to reconcile all things to himself by making peace through Jesus' blood shed on the cross. The Panama Canal, if you think about it, it's a kind of reconciliation, isn't it? There's the Atlantic Ocean, and there's the Pacific Ocean, and they're separated. Okay, you can sneak round the bottom, but follow with me. In a sense, there's a barrier, isn't there, between these two things? There's a much greater separation, isn't there? The Bible's so clear about it. It's the thing that separates us from God. If we're left to ourselves, that's our problem. All of our mess, all of the wrong things we've done, all of our selfishness, the Bible wraps all that up in one tiny little word, sin. All of that stuff has had the effect of placing a barrier between us and the God who has made it. But you see, the death of Jesus has been the cost that swept it all away, that made it possible at last for us to go through, to use the language of this verse, to be reconciled to God. Easter is about the death of Jesus paying the cost, taking all the judgment that our wrong and mess deserves, so God can say, yeah, you're forgiven. You can come through to me. The barrier has gone. That's Easter. Easter in a nutshell. A way through made at incredible cost. A way between us to be united with God again in a way we never could otherwise. Easter is kind of God's invitation. One of these books there is called The Love Story. That's what it is. It's God saying, look, I can break that barrier down. I can build the way, and I've done it through giving my son Jesus to take all the cost of sin, and you can come through to me. When my parents were passing through the Panama Canal that very first time, their ship was in the canal basin. It's kind of, I suppose, like a queue, you know. They weren't all British ships, so they weren't all in a big row, but the basin was just full of ships. They're all waiting for their turn to go through. And the chaplain gave a talk. I'm sure he'd given this talk every time that they got to this point, to the Panama Canal. And he said, we're going from the Atlantic, we're going through to the Pacific. What's the difference between the Atlantic and the Pacific? Well, part of the clue is in the name of the Pacific. It's to do with peace, isn't it? When I was a kid brought up in a North American context, or South America, a lot of North Americans, what we call dummies, you know, the babies, they're pacifiers, aren't they? It's another one of those language things. To do with peace, isn't it? He said, we're going through the ocean of, and believe me, there had been some pretty scary days and nights. I think there's about a nine-day stretch of seeing no land when you go by sea, certainly across the Atlantic, and there's some hairy moments. Well, certainly as a 3-year-old or later on traveling back different ways. But we're going into peace. And he said, look around. Here's all these boats that are waiting to go through. And sure enough, they're in the canal basin. And he said, these are boats from every country. They are boats from every nationality. There are boats there from every possible size. And they can all go through. All of them. Now, if you turned up in your paddleboard, maybe not. But boats of all sorts access the Panama Canal. Doesn't matter where you're from. Doesn't matter how far you've traveled. Doesn't matter what language you speak. You can go through the Panama Canal. And I tell you, the Bible's very clear, isn't it? There's no preference for God as to who can get through to him. It doesn't matter where you've come from. Doesn't matter what your background. Doesn't matter how big a mess. It doesn't matter how good a life you've lived. You can get through. The way has been made for you. But, he said, one by one, every ship, every boat has to wait and has to go through individually. This invitation that God makes ultimately is incredibly personal. It just says to each person, as an individual, what I've done in Jesus has taken down the barrier for you, and you are welcome to come. If you just say to God, I'm sorry for the mess. I'm sorry for the way I've turned my back on you. I've lived without thinking about you. Will you forgive me? God says, come on through. Come on through. So, I don't know how you're going to think of Easter this year. Maybe I've just given a little way of thinking about it freshly. A way through at incredible cost that anybody can come through. And it's a personal invitation. I hope this Easter will be special for you. The world isn't in a happy place, is it? I know I joke a bit about Mr. Trump, but all kinds of things are going on. There's not a lot of security around, is there? But there is one security. Can be brought back into relationship with God.